Welcome to this Excel tips video. My name is Neale Blackwood and we are going to answer 3 questions. Okay, question 1. Is it possible to do a 3D SUMIF? By that I mean to sum a column of values based on the codes in another column through multiple sheets. Back in 2005, I shared a complicated formula that allowed you to mimic a 3D SUMIF. Back in 2005, we didn't have the SUMIFS function, so we could only do a single condition sum using the SUMIF function. Now, a 3D formula, that's an interesting concept for a lot of people. It's a concept that you might not have ever actually found in Excel. So I thought I'd show you quickly what a 3D formula looks like. So that formula there is adding up column B from July through to September. Now, I'm using column B just to shorten the formula because of the example that we're going to work with. You could also have a specific, B1 to B1000 or something in there as well. But again, just to shorten the formula, I'm using the whole of column B. So this is adding up July, August, and September in column B, and it uses this colon between the sheet names. And that is a 3D formula. So the layout in these 3 sheets are identical. So that's why we can just add up column B, basically. And there's no sum function in here, so we can just add up the whole of column B. And that's our check total, because we want to create this 3D SUMIFS function. So here's what we want to do. We've got 2 codes, and we want to add these codes up through these 3 separate sheets. So again, I've just used a simple example here using 3-digit codes. And so we want to add up all the ABCs and through each of these 3 sheets. Now, there is no function to do that that's built into Excel. You can do a 3D calculation with the sum function and also the average and the count functions because they're basic functions. But SUMIF is, or SUMIFS, which I'm going to use the example of, is more complex, and you can't do a 3D calculation with that particular function. But you can mimic it. So you're going to make create a formula that works like a 3D calculation with a SUMIF. And here's how we do it. We're going to use the INDIRECT function. Now, we're going to combine 2 fairly complex techniques here, so you may need to re-watch this video to get a handle on it, or reread the article. So here we go. We're going to use the INDIRECT function. Now, the INDIRECT function is probably the worst named function in Excel. What it does, it allows you to create a reference to a cell using text, basically. So as an example, if I go here and type equals INDIRECT and put in quotation marks B2 and then other quotation marks, what that does is that converts the text from B2 as text into a reference to cell B2, which should have, $31,000 in it. Now, obviously that doesn't help anything because you can just create a reference to that. But let's take this example. So let's say in D1 I type in B2. Okay, and instead of typing it into the INDIRECT, I link to cell D1. So what that's doing, it's converting this text into a reference to B2. And so that gives me the flexibility to change this formula based on D1. So, for example, if I want to look at the total here, I could change that to B4. Okay, so now that's linked to B4. So the beauty of INDIRECT is it allows you to have a flexible formula that you can manipulate using other cells. That in itself is good and gives you some flexibility, but we can use that INDIRECT to then create our 3D references that we need for the SUMIFS function. Now, just a note on indirect. A lot of people who are really good at Excel won't use indirect. The reason is twofold. The main two reasons are it's what's called a volatile function, which means that it calculates every single time Excel calculates. Now, most functions only calculate if the range that they're referring to changes. But with indirect, because of what it's doing, it actually calculates every single time. That can slow your model down. The second reason that people won't use indirect is that it breaks the links that you can follow. So you cannot follow back to cell B4 using an indirect here. Because you're referring to a cell reference, you can't get back to sort of where this is bringing the data in from, which you can do. There's a feature in formulas where you can basically trace precedence and dependence, like where a value is coming from. But you can't do that when you put indirect into the formula. That sort of breaks that ability to track where something's coming from. It's called formula auditing, and some people ignore indirect because it breaks the formula auditing sequence. Okay, and another reason people don't use it is very few people are aware of indirect. So hopefully when you see how it can be used, you might actually take some interest in indirect. I use it as a function of last resort. If I can't do anything with Excel's built-in features, then I will typically resort to the indirect function to solve a problem. Okay, so indirect allows you to build up a reference to a cell or a range using text. Okay, so that's the first part of the solution. The second part of the solution is something called array syntax. So what I'm highlighting on the screen there is array syntax. So it's curly brackets, and then you can refer to text separated by commas. What that does, it instructs Excel to perform three different calculations, three separate calculations. So instead of creating a reference to July and then the exclamation mark and then the column B, it does it three separate times. So we can see that here when I select that part of the formula, and I'm going to press my F9 function key, and that's going to show you what this creates. So as you can see, I've got July column B, August column B, and September column B. So you can sort of see where this is going, because I'm going to do the same over here with column A, F9. So there we have the ranges that we're going to need to create our SUMIFS. So I'm going to hit escape now, and that's going to put the formula back to the way it was. I'll show you a SUMIFS if you're not familiar with it. I'll just do it on one of the sheets. So SUMIFS requires a column or a range to add up, comma, then a range that has the condition that you want to use. So in this case, column A has the code, comma, and then I'm going to come back here and refer to ABC, for example. By the way, when you come back to the sheet here, you can actually get rid of the name of the current sheet because you don't need that in there. You just need A2. So that's what a SUMIFS looks like. So we're adding up column B based on when column A equals, in this case, A2. And again, I'm just using whole columns to keep this simple rather than having ranges in there. Okay, so that's what September's adds up to. Now, normally, what you would have to do is you'd have to do three separate SUMIFS functions to add up July, August, and September. Now, that's not very scalable because we're going to look at how we can add another sheet to our calculation fairly easily instead of having to create another SUMIF if we want to add October in, for example. That's what the SUMIFS looks like, and we're going to create three separate versions of that by using the indirect and these array syntax entries. So I'll show you them again. So you can see sort of how this is building is that creates the reference to B, three separate ones to be. You do need to make sure these are in the same sequence too to get this to work correctly. So we're going July, August, September. And that then creates three separate. So I'm going to do that F9 on this SUMIFS. And that's the three separate results. So you can see that the July one there, that's what we saw here. And then these are the August and September results. And as you can see then, the sum function adds those up to give us the 31871. And yeah, I'm going to press escape here so I go back to my formula. And that's just been copied down basically. So instead of referring to A2, this one here refers to A3, and so it's doing the DEF. This one just adds it up, and this one is a check total, which is doing a proper 3D calculation. But as I mentioned, SUMIFS cannot do a proper 3D SUMIF calculation. It's doing an estimated one, a mimicked one. That was the solution I shared way back in 2005. We can now do that a little bit easier in 2022. Here we go. So here are the sheets. And by the way, I'm going to unhide October here. So here's October. And what I want to do is create a formula that's going to allow me to add in October. So here it is. Instead of typing in the array syntax, what we can do is we can create a sort function. So sort is part of the dynamic array formulas that Excel have added in, and it creates a array syntax. So if I press F9 here, you'll see it. So there we go, July, August, September. So it does that with a formula, which again just makes it that one step easier. So this is now adding up July through to October. Let's, as an example, let's change this to G and G. So there's two in here. Okay, so there's our original one. So if I copy that down, that's the original calculation. And it's as easy as extending that to H and H to then extend it back to the four sheets, which is what we're doing with the check total down here. So using the sort allows you to extend the range rather than like type something in. So it's a lot easier to add another sheet in, for example, to this example. So this uses exactly the same technique, but instead of having to type in the array syntax, the sort function is giving it to you, just referring to the range, which it's a lot easier to modify the range than it is to edit the array syntax. That is the sort of the updated version of it. It allows you to create, again, it's mimicking a 3D SUMIFS. So instead of having to do four separate SUMIFS functions here, we have one, but we're using the indirect to create the four separate ranges, which again, if we select that now and press F9, you'll see there's the four separate results. By the way, I just copied September to October, so that's why they are exactly the same numbers there. So always hit escape when you use that F9, otherwise the formula keeps those entries that have been entered there. So that was a fairly advanced technique. That's probably one of the most advanced techniques I've shared in all my articles. So you might need to go over that again to get your head around it. But the indirect is sort of the function of last resort. It can provide solutions where no other solutions are available apart from maybe a macro or something like that. Just a heads up on the indirect function. Okay, let's have a look at question number 2. I've started using range names and wanted to know if there is a quicker way to create them rather than using the name box or the define name dialog box. Okay, now once you start using range names, it is a little bit addictive, so you might want to start creating more. And to do that, there is a built-in technique Excel has to create lots of range names. But before I dive into that, let's just briefly show you what a range name is. So what you can do is you can name a cell. So you don't think twice about naming a file and naming a sheet and giving them descriptive names. Well, you can name a cell and you can name a range. So let's say we wanted to name this cell super, or just say super, just to keep it short. So this is the name box in the corner here. So you can type in super and that creates a name. You must hit enter. Now I always capitalize the first letter and I'll show you why in a minute. Now once you've created that name, so I've named cell B2 super. So I can go anywhere in this file and type in super and it's going to give me my 10.5% at the moment. So that is really, really cool because you can use that in your formulas throughout the whole file. And it's a lot more descriptive than B2, or in this case with the sheet name and then B2 following it. So using that makes it a lot easier to do a lot of calculations. Also, you don't need to worry about dollar signs because if you just refer to cell B2 and you want to copy it, you've got to put the dollar signs on there so that it doesn't move. Well, when you use a range name, it automatically creates it like a fixed reference. So you don't need to worry about the reference changing. Okay, so that's a range name. Now, as you saw, it's a little bit clunky in that you need to type it in for the name. So let's delete that name. So there's a name manager. So in the formulas section, there's a name manager and there's the name we've just created, super. I'm going to delete it. If you delete a name and the formula still refers to it, you'll get a name error. Now let's see how I can create these three names really quickly. So instead of having to type them in. So here we go. Going to select that range, A2 down to B4. Under in the name manager section, so define names, create from selection is what you want. So click on that. And what this is saying or telling you or asking you, create the names from values in the left column. So that's the name we're going to create. So it's actually going to be called superannuation and payroll tax and workers' compensation. They're the three names. Just a note, you can't have a space in a range name. So because of that, it's going to use the underscore character. So Excel knows the rules and it will never create a range name that breaks the rules. So all you got to do here now, because left column is ticked, and that's all you want ticked by the way, is click OK. And it has now created three separate ranges or range names. So this one, if I click here, is called superannuation, payroll tax, and workers' comp. You can actually make this wider so you can see the whole name. So these are now named and you can use them throughout the file. So that's the quick way to do it. There is another way to do it using a keyboard shortcut. Now, those names are a little bit long, and so when you use them in formulas, those formulas will sort of become longer because of the name length. So what you might want to do is still have your description in the cells, the labels, but create a shorter range name. So you're abbreviating the name. And so what I tend to do is I'll have like a list of labels, but then I'll create a separate list of the range names that I want to create. Sometimes I will use a different color. And what I'm doing here is a red with a italic, just to differentiate them from the other labels. And so again, I can create the list here, or the range name. So there's going to be super, PRT, and W comp. Now to do this one, I'm going to press a keyboard shortcut. So Control Shift and the F3 key. The F3 key is sort of dedicated to range names. So there's a few other shortcuts that use it as well. Again, you just need to make sure left column is ticked. And this time it's going to create these names using the abbreviated names. Okay, so you can check out all of the names in the name manager. So there's PRT, Super, and W comp. So they're the new ones. And also in the drop down. So the name box has a drop down and you can see all of the names. The beauty of it is you can go to it. It's like a navigation feature as well. So if I want to see that original one, I can just click there and that takes you there. So you can use it to sort of navigate around the file as well with these range names. So range names, really powerful. I'm a big proponent of range names. Range names are another topic that does split the Excel community a little bit. Some people say that range names add an extra level of complexity to a file, whereas I tend to treat them as adding an extra level of structure to the file. And you can, as long as you structure your range names correctly, they can improve your formulas and your structure. So again, might be worth playing around with it. As I've said, once you start using range names, you tend to get a little bit addicted to them and you use them a lot. You can overuse them, so just be aware of that. But in general, range names are a good thing. Before we go to the next question, I'll just quickly go through some of the range name rules. I mentioned one of them. You can't have a space in a range name. The other rule is you can't start with a number, and you can't use most symbols. Okay, you can use the full stop, you can use the underscore, we saw that, and you can't use a cell reference, and I'll show you why. Okay, and let's say I want to name this cell QTR1. So when I go here and type QTR1, look what happens. QTR is now a column reference in Excel, so QTR1 is a cell reference. So you can't name a cell the same as a cell reference. That's the reason, because when you type it in the name box, it'll actually take you there. So just a heads up on that. So you could, you can go Control Home to get back here. I could use QTR underscore 1, and that's okay. So just a heads up on that. So they're the rules. The recommendations, I did mention the capitalization, didn't I? So I'll show you why. So if I go into a cell and type super, let's say I'll just use the shortened version, but I forget to put the R on the end. Okay, so I've made a typo. So notice at the moment everything is in lowercase. Okay, so there's my name error. Now, as soon as I correct that, then it does capitalize it. So it's like when you type in a function name, you can type the function name in lowercase and Excel will change it to uppercase once it recognizes it. Well, that's why I capitalize a letter in my range names. I also, you don't have to do this, but I also capitalize the first letter of each word in my range names. So with payroll tax, you can see I like it because it's easier to read when you've got a capital for the second word or the third word as well. So I capitalize the first letter of each word that I use in my range names. Okay, let's finish off with a date question. Here we go. I use the equals now function to update today's date in a spreadsheet. The problem is it includes a fraction for the time of day. How do I just get the date without the associated fraction? Well, the answer is actually a different function. You use the today function. So the today function only gives you today's date. So here's some examples. So that the formula's in column B, and they're showing the results, and column C shows you what the actual formula is in column B. So that's the now function, and it gives you the time. So you can see exactly when I'm recording this video. There's today, and that's the same date but with no time. So there's 0 time. Now what you can do with the now function is actually truncate it. So there's a trunc function which stands for truncate, and what it does, it basically cuts off the time. It doesn't round, doesn't do any rounding, it just deletes basically any decimal that you might have on a number, and that applies to dates. And I should mention, dates are numbers in Excel. So here's the date that I'm working with now, because I'm recording the video, is the 21st of the 11th. That is the underlying number for that date. So day 1 was the 1st of the 1st, 1900. Okay, so if I get rid of the format on that cell and just make it general, you'll see it's 1. So that's when the universe started according to Excel, and every day since has been given a number. So today, when I'm recording this, 44,886 days after the 1st there. So you can see that's the day number. time is a fraction. So again, I'm recording this at this time. That's the fraction that represents this time. So 6 o'clock in the morning is 0.25, noon is 0.5, and 6 o'clock in the evening is 0.75. So the 24 hours are split up as a decimal for a time. That's how the now function works. If you update it, so if I press F9, that will recalculate it so we can see a minute's gone past, and the fraction will have updated. So that's just a sort of a brief intro into dates. The today function is the easiest to use. Oh, I will show you a keyboard shortcut that inserts the date. So it's Control and the semicolon, so the wink. And that inserts the date. Now that is a data entry. It's not a formula. Okay, the today function works like a formula. So when you open the file tomorrow, this cell is going to have the 22nd of November in there. Okay, and if you wanted to actually put a timestamp in, you use Control Shift, and which will be the colon, and that puts the time of day in. So 8:57. Okay, so covered a lot of techniques there. As I said, the one I started with was quite complex in that it involved two separate techniques which are reasonably advanced in Excel, and combine them to provide a solution that doesn't really exist. So there is no 3D SUMIFS in Excel, but we can mimic it using the indirect and the array syntax. We looked at range names. Again, I'm a big proponent of range names in Excel, and that's the easy way to create them, is using create from selection. And finally, we looked at how we can chop off the time from a date using the trunc function, or truncate, it's short for. But you don't really need to use that because you can just use the today function, which provides today's date. Okay, hope you found that useful, and thanks for watching.